Yeah, for glamour show.
Wow. Hey, everybody. Welcome to this OBI Lunch and Learn hybrid. Some of us are in person, some of us are online, and we're just really glad you joined us today. My name is Renee Miller. I'm the program director at the Oregon Bioscience Incubator, and we are here at CBRE headquarters, their Portland office on the 35th floor of the Wells Fargo Tower. And so it's pretty great here. We really appreciate you hosting us today.
Pleasure.
Yes. So without further ado, I would like to introduce our presenters today. Ajay Malhotra, he's the first vice president of CBRE in Portland. And Kristen Hammond is senior vice president. And they both have extensive experience in commercial real estate leasing, and also both have technology backgrounds. So that you bring some interesting perspective to the table. And today they are going to break down some of the mysteries of commercial real estate leasing. And with that, feel free to take it away.
Great. Thank you so much. We really appreciate your organizing and getting attendees to come in person. Those that feel comfortable doing so, it's great to have the chance to do that in person, as well as welcome to all of those of you online. I apologize. I might be turning kind of left and right. The camera is there, so you can see us, but then we have people here. So it's great to have you all here. My name is Ajay Malhotra, as Renee mentioned, and I work closely with Kristen Hammond. We have both been at CBRE for a number of years. We can talk about the company and our backgrounds in a moment, but if you have anything else you want to add before we get started?
No, just really appreciate everyone coming out today. And our idea behind this forum is that we want it to be very interactive. So please interrupt at any time with any questions you have. This is not a hard and fast agenda that we're following.
Yeah. So, and we really, to that point, we really don't want to necessarily just cover what we're covering. If you have questions, and in fact, if you have questions right now or topics you want to make sure are covered, feel free to suggest a few. Are there any burning topics you really want to make sure you get answered before you leave here? Any questions you have in mind? Go for it. Yeah. Any thoughts? Just so you can help guide us a little bit.
Yeah. Not yet, but I think I will have some at the end.
Okay, without hesitation, please. Amanda, or you guys have any initial?
Okay.
Okay, great. Well, let's just start with, would you like to share our content, or would you like me to?
I can share it.
Okay. Yeah, usually we'd be standing, but we'll stay seated for the benefit of the camera.
Teacher.
CBRE is a very large international commercial real estate firm. We're actually the oldest and largest. We're about 118 years old now. We serve all manner of clients and do everything imaginable in real estate. So we're have a lot of resources and can help you in anything related to commercial real estate. Kristen and I've been at the company for about 9 years now. My background is actually electrical engineering. I was in the technology industry for about 20 years before joining CBRE. And that's a little bit about my background.
My background's been all over the board, but my technology experience was more catered to website development, information architecture, those sorts of things way back in the heyday. So I'm dating myself. Slide. There you go. I moved into real estate in the early 2000s. So I've been doing this for about 20 years now.
Yeah, so the title of our presentation is Demystifying Commercial Real Estate Leasing, just because there's a lot of jargon and sometimes it can feel opaque or uncertain, especially if you're at an incubator, and we work with lots of companies that have graduated from incubator to help them kind of figure out what's next. You're so busy in your day-to-day business and raising funding and getting equipment and so forth. Sometimes it's, you're not sure, like, how do I take that next step? And that's what we're here to help demystify. And again, at any point, please ask questions. We want this to be beneficial for you. So if you wouldn't mind advancing the slide. So these are the 5 or 6 topics we are going to cover in the course of our presentation. I won't really read them out for you right now. We just have separate sections to cover these items. So we'll get started with the first one, if you wouldn't mind advancing this one more time. With an overview of just a broad overview of the commercial real estate market in Portland, and once more, please. Thank you.
All right, so we'll start with where we are today. Much like the residential market, the commercial office market's been a little crazy of late as well. We were on a very hot trajectory over the last 5-6 years. COVID hit and things very much kind of had a tap the brakes moment in terms of activity and people making decisions, because who knows who's going to occupy space or how they're going to use it. But it didn't necessarily change the cost. So you can see our 2010 to 2021, that's the end of 2021 rate climb. And I will say another point out that this is kind of typical of Portland. It's a very slow climb, where if you go to a San Francisco or Phoenix, they tend to spike and then they'll drop down and then they'll spike. We've always been a bit of a slow climb. But right around 2015, 16 is where we really started to see some aggressive rent climb. And that tied mostly to the fact that a lot of the buildings in the downtown area specifically changed hands and went into institutional investor hands rather than regional local owners. So that meant big money pushed into the asset to build out amenity spaces like lockers, shower rooms, fitness centers, conferencing and training facilities, rooftop decks, bike parking, that sort of thing. But with all of those amenities comes a price, so that increases the rental rate. So we are at a $34 and change per square foot. That's an annualized number. And that takes into account all of the product type in downtown in particular. So Class A buildings like the one you're in right now, down to 3-story, what we call Class C, which is it's a lower cost option. They don't have as many on-site amenities. Maybe the construction is more of a wood construction. The age of it tends to drive that a lot. So if it's an older building that hasn't had a lot of upgrades or refreshing done to it, then it tends to stay on the lower end of the rate. We are just about at the end of new construction. The Ritz-Carlton and 11W will be the last 2 office buildings that deliver. Those will deliver into this year and beginning of next year. And then there's no new office product slated to be built. We are overbuilt at this point. So that brings us to our vacancy rate, which in my 20 years of doing it, we are at an all-time high. So we're at 25% vacant for downtown. You can see a couple of the other submarkets. Northwest is sort of the slab town area. And that's largely being driven by some new construction, as well as the old XPO campus being vacated in part and sold and put into some institutional owners' hands as office. East side is southeast all the way up to the Burnside Bridge. That's a pretty high number for close-in east side. There's not a lot of inventory over there, but we have, with the addition of the 5 MLK building at the Burnside Bridgehead and all that's going on right around that area, along with coming right down Grand and MLK to the Markham Bridge. There's a lot of construction in there, some Killian product where Simple Bank, now BBVA, now PNC Bank has gone. There's a lot of vacancy over there as well. And then the Lloyd district is our low one. And that's because, one, there's not a lot of product over there. It tends to be a lot of big occupiers. So Kaiser and KinderCare are 2 of the larger ones. Liberty Mutual's another. That number will go up as KinderCare space actually hits the market, because they're leaving Lloyd district and they're moving out to Cruz Way and Lake Oswego in a much smaller footprint. So all in all, vacancy's going up. Rates have gone flat, and our concessions are where we're seeing some big gives, because as we all know, construction costs are crazy. Doesn't matter what it's tied to, commercial or residential, they're very high. So landlords are now offering $100 to $140 square foot tenant improvement allowances on some decent term deals, because it takes that much just to get a standard build out. So what you're looking at here right now, this is a $280 square foot build out. Just to give you some sense of, wow, and that's all happened. That all happened pre-COVID. The other one is free rent. Lots of free rent. We've seen deals where they're giving you a year of it, depending on how long the term is, up to 15, 16 months.
Please.
So just a quick question kind of on that. In terms of the build out, then that is sometimes part of the negotiation. The landlord will cover part of that build out cost. At least right now.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. And 3 buckets that you look at when you're doing a deal: rent, length of term, so how long are you willing to commit to being in there, and the tenant improvements. And those are the three economic buckets that the landlord will move the money around in. Everything is underwritten based on those buckets. And our job is to find out what is the bottom dollar that they have underwritten. A lot of these landlords now have equity holders and lenders behind them. So there is a line, there is a bottom that they hit because those lenders will simply take keys back. So we've had plenty of people go, well, it's vacant. Wouldn't they be happy to get half as much on rent? The answer is no. And if you talk to any big institutional occupier like a Google or an Amazon, they all know the game. It's easier for them to just write it down on their books. Well, lenders do the same. Than for them to start taking half of the amount that they've already budgeted in for occupying that space. So when we look at buildings, looking at the landlord profile is very important because depending on what's behind that landlord, if it's a local owner, depending on what you need, they're less likely to have a lot of debt on the building. They tend to just own it and they're looking for cash flow. They might not throw as much money toward it, but they might discount your rent a lot. Big institutional owners like the group that owns this building, they're going to give you a big tenant improvement allowance to get it filled out because they want to keep that rent rate at a certain number because that's what the lender was receiving as the underwriting when they agreed to loan on the building. That's probably more than you wanted to know, but.
No, that's really helpful. Thank you.
And everyone's able to hear properly on Zoom and audio and video sharing is going all right? Yeah, please, Michael.
Can I ask a question? So when you say office space, I mean, for the buyer side community, there's lab space, mixed use space.
How does it look?
Like, how does it look like there? I mean.
Yep. So your lab build outs are much like medical space. It's a lot more expensive. As you all know, just your equipment alone, you know, as a business is very costly. When we're talking about lab space, it looks very similar to medical space. They've always historically had a very expensive build out because there's a lot of roof penetrations for venting, for hoods and other. There's a lot more plumbing and water. With plumbing, the real cost is not getting the water in, it's getting the water out. It's the sewer. That's the heavier expense. So when we talk about doing core drills into the concrete floors, and we're doing a lot of them because you've got a lot of drains for each of your lab stations, that's where another cost comes in. And then power. If you've got a lot of heavy equipment that takes some excess power beyond standard office, that's another place where we see the build out costs increase because they've got to bring in additional power. So when we look at lab space, and we'll get to a sample later, oftentimes we try, depending on the size of the footprint, so how much space you need, we try to get single story tilt up product because it's much less expensive because we're not having to run a vent system all the way up multi-stories. Sometimes we can just push it out the side. The same goes for the plumbing and the electrical. So if the runs are shorter, the cost is cheaper. And then we can also run into, again, depending on your equipment, payload issues. So how much weight can the floor take? It's a lot easier to mitigate if it's just a slab we're going onto in a single story. Doesn't mean we can't do multi-story. Again, smaller footprints can manage that because there's only so much weight you can put in. But when we get to our case study for like ABSI, 78,000 square feet of it, we need to go on a single story. You know, half of that is lab. It's a lot of weight. It can't really sit on an office floor like this very efficiently. Their cost would have been at least double, if not triple.
Kristen, there's a question from Heather. She asked, what has the range been lately for TI, tenant improvement, negotiated per square foot if the lease is negotiated for a 5-year lease?
So for 5 years right now, depending on where you are, if you're downtown, you can get upwards of $85 a foot. If you're in the suburbs, we're probably closer to 55, 60. I'll say 55 to 65 a foot for landlord contribution toward costs.
Okay.
On a 5-year. If you go 10 years, double all that.
Oh, okay. No.
As was implicit, or I should say maybe not, but one of the clear messages from this first overview slide is that it's a very, very heavily tenant-favored market. You know, pre-pandemic, we had vacancy levels that were closer to 8, 9, or 10%, a more healthy, market with new construction rolling. Now with, vacancies north of 20%, it is very, very much a heavily tenant-favored market, and landlords, whether they're kind of local, regional landlords or institutional landlords, are very motivated, to try to strike a deal and attract you to their building, and you'll have lots of options when the time comes and for several years to come, for sure.
And there will be a drop in some of this. We're just waiting for the first landlord, because it will happen, to hand the keys back. So this happened in 2008-9. Will be some landlords that cannot service the debt and make it make sense. So they will hand the keys to the lender. The lender will write it down. They will put it back on the market for sale, and the new buyer will get it at a much lower cost basis. And then they can drop the rates. And then the market will have a problem, because now we've got somebody who can get far more competitive because the cost basis is lower. So we expect some keys to go back. We have started to already see some owners who have a little more horsepower go back and refinance and push the debt out further. So their timeline for flipping out of the building is now elongated, and that's going to give them some room as well to get more competitive on rates. So again, we expect that to start flushing out later this year and really into next year.
So thank you for those questions. Anything else on top of mind before we continue?
Maybe one follow-up, if I might. The question I still have is like, what's your guess and how many of the landlords would be willing to entertain actually working with somebody to put in lab space or any kind of non-standard office space? If it's like, I know there's some people that have like workshops or stuff like that to get it more diverse.
Sure. So
rather than just,
there will be quite a few landlords who will entertain that. It just won't be buildings like this. That's it. But we call them lower rise buildings. They'll all entertain that. The biggest trick we find for groups in the bioscience industry is that this is a young market for it. It's not like Boston or San Diego, where they have second, third, fourth generation space built out. So you don't have a lot of costs going in, because this is why we're, with OBI and OTRADI, it's built out. There's some infrastructure there. And so we're going to have to still build out more of it. So there's going to be some front end costs, but as we're seeing more companies come up in this vertical, landlords are tracking that very closely and are starting to get more aggressive about building some of it out. A lot of it can be repurposed for medical as well, and that's kind of their fallback. Okay, well, we build all this out, and we're not going to put an office user in here if this tenant grows out of it or relocates or whatever, but we could put a medical user in here, a physician, a dentist, that kind of thing. So more of them are thinking about that. It does tend to just be this sort of, we'll call it 10, 12 stories and shorter, because it's, again, cost-wise, running that up in a building like this gets a little tricky, other than ground up to maybe 4th floor, which they might entertain, but we probably wouldn't recommend it.
Also, keep in mind, sorry, just to build onto that one comment, keep in mind that while we don't have a long history of bioscience or medical build-outs, the region does have a long history of highly technical build-outs for, suppliers to Intel, data center community, of course, different. So there are landlords who are accustomed to the idea of a customized technical build-out, even though it may not be necessarily in your industry, or that's becoming, newer, more prominent. Please.
Yeah, I guess my question relates to that is, how do landlords regard build-out for technology and life science companies versus build-outs for an office space here? Because the build-outs here are primarily cosmetic, whereas those in the tech space or life science are going to be much more capital intensive, long-lived types of build-outs.
Yep. So again, it depends on, we call it product type, which is just the building, shape, size. High rises are not designed for that. So they're going to scrutinize it more carefully, because the cost to do it will be enormous. The expectation will be that you're looking for the landlord to offset more of that cost. And a lot of that cost is associated with the fact that it's tall building. But the low rise, buildings. There's a number of them on the close and east side that have some lab space built out or medical space on floors off the ground. There's a number of them out in the burbs. The single story, they expect it. That's exactly what they're built for. It's not an issue beyond just the buckets. Again, most owners, this is their business. It is to get a profit out of tenanting a building. If they can make the rent, the TIs, and the term align, and you're a good credit tenant, and they're all throwing the dice, they're taking a bet. Sometimes some are more willing to take a risk than others. That's what I would say is some will only deal with tenants who have been around for 50 years and have big credit. And others will absolutely chase the startups because they know what the potential is. And they feel like if they build out that space, there's always someone behind that startup in the same field to fill it. That's something that will work well for the bioscience and lab side of things because they all know, because that message has been sent in spades. We got users, we don't have the space. If we've got this second gen, third gen space, you don't need to worry. It's gonna lease up because we don't have a lot of options right now. Those landlords will absolutely play ball. Again, it's just getting those three things to align so that both sides can make it work. So,
Great.
does that answer your question?
Yeah, thanks.
That's a long couple, yeah. Yeah, one more. That's outside internal lab, but go to the next one. So yeah, a little bit about where we can help. So similar to maybe if you're ever involved in a residential real estate transaction, there's a seller's representative and a buyer's representative. We mostly do leasing. Of course, we help people buy and sell buildings too, but in commercial leasing as well, there's two representatives, the landlord's representatives and the tenant representative. Kristen and I are primarily almost always the tenant's representative. That's what we do. We specialize in that. We've got a lot of history with that. We understand how to represent a tenant's interests. We're all licensed in every state. You know, every state has their own laws, but a key element of our licensing is that we have a fiduciary obligation to you as a tenant. We're obligated to protect your interest and your interest only and advocate for you when we're working with the landlord and their representative. So we have that, oath of duty and allegiance to you, if you will. I told you a little bit about the company. We have tremendous resources in terms of research, market data, but then ourselves, we have tremendous amounts of transaction experience. So we'll show you a little bit later what a process flow chart looks like. Like, how do you get started? If you decide that, you've kind of outgrown the space or the welcome of OTRADI and you need your own space for any number of reasons, we can help you walk through each piece of it. We're here to guide you through it. We're here to demystify it for you. We're here to, explain the jargon. And then if you need additional resources around legal, around architecture, around general contractors, getting estimates, how do I get a moving company? All of those things, we can be a single point of contact for you so that you can focus more on your business and rely on an expert, quote unquote, experts like us to help be your guide, your advocate, your fellow traveler in the process. So that's what a tenant representative is. And they exist in all the other verticals too. We primarily do office, industrial, medical. There are others that focus on retail or industrial logistics. We are, a prospective tenant representative for you, as we were the tenant representative for Sean McLean at AppSci. A case study we'll show you in a few minutes as well. So any questions about what we could do for you as a tenant rep, please?
Not that that would be an issue here, but is there any sort of relationship you have to enter to benefit from the fiduciary relationship, or is that implied by taking on a?
Often we might ask that you sign a letter appointing us as your tenant representative. It's a mere formality because it also says at any time you're not happy with that, you can just fire us too. No, it's simply by the fact that we're licensed by the state of Oregon, that if we enter into a tenant relationship, an agency relationship with you as your tenant representative, we're obligated to advocate for your interest no matter what. So. Okay. And on Zoom, feel free to chime in or chat, however you would like to address your questions or ask your questions, feel free. One more, please. Okay. Yeah, go ahead, one more too. When I entered the industry 8 or 9 years ago, even I was very confused about this subject. And my friends said, well, how do you guys get paid? And this is also murky. Why can't it be clear? And I've continued to come across, almost 10 years in the industry, with clients who maybe this is their first time exploring an office project. Like, all this stuff you're promising, sounds really cool, but I'm not sure I can afford you. And how are you really being paid and what are you being paid? In the United States, which is different than many other countries, in fact, in the United States, by and large, landlords are paying brokerage commissions fees. So in the same way that in a residential transaction, the seller is paying the seller's broker as well as the buyer's broker, the 5 or 6% that they split evenly, landlords pay the fees of their own broker as well as the tenant broker that would be us that represent you. So of course the costs are built into the industry and the rate and so forth, but when we represent you as a tenant for our brokerage services, there are no fees charged to you. So that's just one thing to keep in mind. And all the research, you might say, I don't need an office yet, but I want some information, I want some data, I want some reports. We're happy to give all that to you anytime you need it. Our contact information will be at the end of this. Don't hesitate to ask any questions. It comes with no fees or obligations. Sometimes there's questions about, what are the things you might be responsible for from a capital expenditure standpoint. Kristen mentioned a moment ago that, landlord contributions in addressing Heather's question, landlord contributions to the tenant improvement allowance might be $50 or $60 per square foot for, let's say, a 5-year lease. Let's say your build out cost as estimated by a general contractor, and you work with them on your equipment, you're venting your hoods, and you realize that your build out costs are going to be closer to $150 or $200. It's that balance that will be your responsibility. So the landlord would have contributed $50. If your build out cost is $150, then that $100 per square foot is in fact your money. You're paying the general contractors and the architects and others to do it. We are not part of that, but that is another aspect of, what am I going to be looking at paying if I enter into a commitment to build out a new space.
And is that tenant improvement taken as a adjustment to the rent?
It is not. I should say there's 3 levers. So that it'll be adjusted at the time your deal is struck. You'll have a certain length of lease term, you'll have a certain rental rate, and a certain $1 per square foot tenant improvement allowance. So that tenant improvement allowance, there'll be some rules around how you can spend it, usually not used to offset rent because they've already made those calculations. It's used to defray your cost of construction.
Mm-hmm. But I mean, for the tenant, is the out-of-pocket costs going to be essentially the same whether or not they have tenant improvements?
No, the difference would be that they don't give you as much of an allowance. So not all landlords are equal. So we could look at 3 buildings. Your costs could be $120 a foot to build out. And one building, their contribution will be $50, but another building might offer you $70. And a third one might also offer you $50. And so then you're going to see that one of those buildings, and this is part of the process we run, starts to rise up in terms of minimizing your cost exposure. Because at the end of the day, it's balancing cost exposure for the tenant with, does it work? Is it in a location that your people will come to? Does it meet some of the environmental needs? Do you have seismic minimal requirements? Do you have light minimal requirements? Is there any concerns around air filtration beyond just the lab, but just the regular office space? And, having MERV units has become pretty standard now since COVID. So there are a lot of buildings are going back and adding additional HVAC units for even cleaner air, because this has been expressed by tenants as a concern now for all the obvious reasons. So it's kind of managing all of those various components that actually, when you start thinking about it, which is part of what we do, there's, anywhere between 10 and 20 of them. And we just we come in and help you prioritize, in order, what are the top 5, what are the next 5, knowing that we've got to get the top 5, and then we need to try and get as many of the next 5 as possible, or if it's 3 and 3, whatever the case may be. But it's balancing all of those out so that you have a good experience moving in. Because the worst thing that can happen to a tenant is, number one, we go in and we've established a very poor relationship with your landlord, because you got to live with that person for however long your lease contract is thereafter. And you never want a tenant going into a space and there's friction with the landlord already, because there will be things that will pop up. You want to be in good favor with the landlord to get those things taken care of quickly, maybe at the landlord's cost, even if it's not contractually their obligation, whatever the case may be. we want to make sure that it works for you, that everybody's happy and there aren't any hidden things that we didn't disclose or didn't uncover. Like roof has a history of really bad leaks. It's a little bit like residential in that regard. Like we help you set up the team to figure out all of that. But Jay and I will let you know if the landlord's got a lot of debt and he's likely to give his keys back, because that can impact what goes on for your future tenancy. So there's all these sorts of things that we just try to manage and get them all exposed on the front end so that you're aware of it. And then we go through and we start checking down the boxes and figuring out what is the most important and what is a nice to have. And if we can get the nice to haves, we will, but we definitely get the most important.
And part of what we're able to bring to that equation is because we have such a high volume of transactions and long history in the market. But if you were to go and contact a landlord and ask for a proposal, they would give you one, but you may not have enough data or comps to benchmark their response.
Yeah.
And if out of the gate, a landlord we know offers you 1 month of free rent when we just did a deal with the same landlord that gave us 6 months of free rent, we kind of help bring honesty to the, or maybe more transparency to you. And so you understand what does the market really bear right now? So all our transaction volume and our landlord relationships allow us to guide you and say, you know what, we can push back here to get you more tenant improvement allowance. Note that your rent's going to go up a little bit, or we can help you tweak those knobs and levers to match your circumstances.
We'll also know what other tenants are doing. So we've had occasions where we knew before the landlord or tenant was going to leave, and we use that as part of our deal with a new tenant. You're going to have a big vacancy. You need to get our tenant in here because you're going to have a big block to have to lease. So it's all the market knowledge. Broker's a broker. It's how much market knowledge do they have and how current is it? Because that's the value proposition for our clients.
How much risk is there as the tenant if your landlord hands back the keys?
Your contract, if you have a lease in place, they have to honor that lease. They cannot change any of that. But if that new owner comes in and maybe they aren't as reputable, when your lease expires or is getting close to that, we might run into some things. They may not maintain a building as nicely as you've been paying for. They may jack the rents just because they want to. They may not be willing to put any more money into your space, but you might need a refresh. I don't have any instance that I could point to anywhere nationally where the keys have been handed back, it's gone to the lender, and anything has happened to existing tenants. But if you are in the midst of negotiating a lease, it's a hot mess, because now who has the authority to execute a contract? Nobody. So then you lose months of time, because this process does take a lot of time. And once you get down the road with a selected landlord, the last thing you want to do is get to the final yard line and something happens and you can't get the contract done. You've lost all that time, and having to pivot and start over is 99.99% of the time very detrimental to our client, because they got timelines, because they've got business based on timelines. So you need your lab up and running. Absci had this. They needed their lab up and running by a set date, so they had something new coming in and they were going to have to double their volume. So it's that kind of stuff. So knowing the stability of the landlords actually becomes very important.
Yeah, go ahead. I think we've covered a little bit of this, but yeah, go ahead. Yeah, a little bit more about jargon. So rental rates, as Kristen was describing the market overview, the figures she talked about, the $34 per square foot per year, is quoted as a full service gross rate, or an FSG rate. So if we have the pleasure of working with any of you at some point in time, you'll say, I need this, this, and that. We'll find some marketing flyer to describe the building, and the marketing flyers will have pictures and description of amenities and transit, blah, 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 and then it'll quote a rental rate and a few letters at the end. Full service gross, typically, or triple net. Most of the time for the buildings you're looking at, it'll be a triple net figure. A building like this often quotes, a Class A office tower will often quote a full service gross rate. And that basically means that it's all and everything's included. Your base rent is included, your pro rata contribution to the property taxes is included, your contribution to maintaining the elevators and the HVAC is included, lights, janitorial, that all included. It's an all-inclusive rate. Granted, there are adjustments that happen over years. Put that aside for the moment. By contrast, kind of at the other end of the spectrum, and there's a few other flavors in between these two, but these are the two more popular ones. A triple net rate excludes the items that you see over there. So it excludes property taxes,
But it says
insurance.
it includes.
Well, I'm sorry, it was meant to show that it excludes, the triple net rate excludes that, excuse me. That was, looks like the bullet got pushed to the wrong place. And sometimes in some buildings, the triple net rate may or may not include utilities and or janitorial. Again, this is where we help you understand if or if not. And if there are buildings that are quoting rates in different figures, then we help you equalize them to help you understand, well, over here, the triple nets include utilities, but over there they don't. Or this full service rate, this full service gross rate compared to this triple net rate, and then we will find out for you what are the triple nets. What is the dollars, how many dollars per square feet are expected for these 3 or 4 items, taxes, insurance, common area maintenance, and so forth. So you really understand what your all out rent number is going to be. And again, it's just a piece of jargon, but it can be confusing. And then again, if we have the chance to work with you, as we get downstream, we'll provide you financial analyses to whatever detail and rigor you or your CFO would like to see to help compare the occupancy costs across the 2 or 3, 4 or 5 different buildings you're looking at that wrap in the tenant improvement allowance proposed, the expected costs to build out your space, any parking, any concessions the landlord is offering. Concessions may be in the form of numbers of months of free rent. So we can all make that easy and digestible to understand. Again, none of that costs anything more. It's just what we do to help you understand that.
But lab and medical has always been triple net because of the uniqueness of the build out. So extra plumbing, extra power, always been that way. And that what they do is they let you have control over your utility usage because you're going to have peaks and valleys of your utility usage. And when you peak, you're probably going to peak pretty high over a standard office user. So they'd rather not try to manage and average that out and distribute it over a broad tenant base because it won't be the same. It would be like trying to get us to absorb costs while you guys are running a lab 24/7, 365. It doesn't sit well. So with any kind of lab space, data centers pretty much go into their own standalone buildings for this reason because they're such a power hog. Lots of industrial where they have heavy equipment running. And so we've got 480 volt running through there for new 24/7 operations, always triple net. You get to have control over your utilities because you're running a little differently than the standard office user.
Next.
Right, yeah, please, we're running actually right on time. Yeah, go ahead, one more, please. We have
Almost all.
covered most of this, but the other element of the costs that you should have in mind is beyond your equipment, of course, is furniture. And that's something also that, depending upon the condition of you may not have a heavy office need, but furniture, FF&E, furniture, fixtures, and equipment are the tenant's responsibility. So there may be a component of that sometimes that the tenant improvement allowance can be directed towards. More often that is the case that it's not, but that's just something else to keep in mind. Any questions about build out cost, tenant improvement cost, who's paying?
Maybe just going back to the FSG, would you expect there to be terms associated with that? And I'm thinking specifically like, I have some servers, we are not a server farm, but am I going to run into friction there?
No.
Not at all.
No.
No, all businesses will have that.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, great.
It's called an IT closet. You can have up to 6 racks in there before they start getting concerned. Your only cost that you might run into is if you do have, let's say 6 racks, it's probably running warm, and we might need supplemental cooling, and that can come into play as well. Sometimes the landlord will factor that in if they think that there's useful life beyond your tenancy there. In the case of like Osram, who we put out Hillsborough, we got the landlord to replace 8 units that were near the end of their useful life on their dime. And then they covered the cost of 2 of the additional. I think we had to add 5 because they need a lot of cooling for their lab space. But it's just a lot of sort of figuring out which levers we can pull and where we can push, and how hungry a landlord is to get tenancy. Because the other thing that landlords are looking at this day and age is flipping out of their building. So for them, it's cash flow and it's a rent roll. And when they have taken a loan for 3, 5, 7, now we're talking 10-year terms. It's just new, but we had 2 years of COVID, so it's messed them all up. They're looking for what the rent roll looks like on the back half of that, because that's what they're going to value the building on and sell it for, and that's where they make their money. So sometimes just getting tenants in there, that's what they need. Like we can take a hit and lose money on the first 2 years from you. Maybe it's the first 4 years if the market gets really dire, which it is. But if you're in there for 10 years and we can really see the profit on the last 5, done, do it.
So we have 2 more topics left. One is just, you can go ahead, one more, is slightly an eye chart, but just to show you, we'll walk you through the process beginning to end, and this is exactly what we do with outside and what we do all day long with other tenants. And we have a couple of high points about the outside case study right after that. Before we dive into that, any other questions or topics you wanted us to cover on the Zoom call or in the room?
I'd be curious about subleases. We could dive into that a little bit.
Okay, sure. You want to kick
Yeah,
off?
so we'll just kick through this really quickly. This is just our visual for breaking out what is otherwise a very lengthy and detailed process. But essentially, when we come into every client, we want to have a strategy session where we're trying to figure out what you need, what your growth looks like, what your head count 2 years, 4 years, 6 years from now. Where are all your employees living? How often will they be coming in? What are we budgeting? What's your revenue growth? All of those basics. Then we'll kick into aligning options for you to take a look at that we think fall close enough within these parameters that they're worth consideration. And once we pick 2 or 3, we start throwing paper at it, and that's when we start doing the push back and forth to really drill down on the best possible terms. I think probably what I want to point out the most is that this whole process, depending on the size of your space, so square footage, if you're a really large user, 18 months. If you're a small user right now, we used to say maybe 6, I'm going to tell you 10 to 12, because of the construction bottleneck. Lead times on materials are pushed out. Lead times on lining up labor for contractors is pushed out. So if you're somewhere between, let's say, 5,000 and 10,000, you probably want to give yourself at least 10 months in advance of occupying that space. If you're under 5,000 feet, it'll just depend. We might be able to find something small that we can plug you into pretty easily, but I certainly wouldn't want to go less than 6 months. But again, construction industry's got everything a little bit on its ear. The good news is the city of Portland just changed their permitting process. That was a big factor in some of this. They were taking upwards of 12 weeks to issue a permit, which is not acceptable. They have revamped their system, and it's supposed to make that go much more smoothly and quickly. So that should help alleviate some of it on the front end, but materials and labor are what they are right now.
Yeah. Subleases. So subleases are basically when, somebody has signed a master lease with the landlord and they realize that they don't need as much space, either all of it or some of it, and they're not going to occupy it. They want to recover some of their rent by subleasing their space. So in that case, the tenant is your kind of, we call sub-landlord. Oftentimes subleases are more affordable than the rate that you might get in a direct lease. The terms are often shorter, and many times subleases might come furnished. The challenge in your particular world is that there's not a lot of subleases for lab or medical space, just because we don't have a lot of lab or medical space. But that's generally what a sublease is.
So your relationship is with that subleaser, not the landlord of the.
Your contractual relationship is with the sublessor, correct. However, as part of your sublease, you are also basically binding yourself to follow any rules and restrictions that are in the master lease.
Okay.
Now, the master tenant remains
On the
the
hook.
primary responsible party and on the hook to the landlord.
Mhm.
So if you end up defaulting, they're going to go after the master landlord, but you remain bound by both contracts.
And Heather also pointed out here that make sure that you negotiate the ability to sublease your space from the building owner when
That's
negotiating your lease.
Almost all, yeah.
It's
So that
standard, everyone
should
does
meet
that, or they should, yes, yes.
Yeah.
For sure,
There's
yeah.
also rights of first offer, which provide for some expansion that you can, take at a later date versus having to take it before you're ready to occupy and pay rent on it. There's termination options we can negotiate in, so, if we get you into a space and you outgrow it and we can't accommodate you, if we have a termination option in there, that lets you get out for some nominal penalty and start the process over to find a bigger space. Or if you sell and the buyer says, I'm moving it all to Boston, and part of the deal is we have this termination option. One, you can get out of it, and two, hate to say it, but it'll make the value of your purchase to that buyer better because they can see that they can relieve themselves of that real estate obligation, which when we're talking about M&A, that becomes a real factor.
And a couple more slides for the last topic. Right there, yeah. Well, we met Sean when he was in 500 square feet at OTRADI, and we first met in the conference room overlooking the river. And over the years, we stayed in touch. And then a few years ago, he reached out and said, they're going to be going big. And we were very fortunate to be brought in to help him and CFO Greg Schiffman and others go through that process that Kristen just described, really understanding their needs, the talent they wanted to recruit, the amenities they needed, the locations, building quality and so forth. Do you want to speak a little bit about the landlord?
Sure.
And
So Sean, as you know, has moved over to Vancouver because at the time Washington State was offering some incentives. And he moved into a downtown building that was new construction, but it was timber construction. So it was probably more in line with some of the cool, funky stuff you see over on the close-in east side here. It was a little unusual because he was up on the third floor. So getting back to the equipment piece, they had to spend a lot of money renting a crane to take the windows out of that building and load equipment in through the windows because that was the only way it was going to get in there. The freight elevator was non-existent and the passenger elevator was not big enough. So these are things we think about when we're looking at stuff. But they loved the look and feel. It represented the culture he wanted to build with the firm. And they gradually expanded on that floor till they had the entire floor. So they started out something small and then they kept moving around the floor until they had the whole floor. And then there was no more space and they needed more space. And they were on the crux of their IPO. So there was some big things in motion contractually. And he wanted to stay downtown. He had ideas that downtown had more of the energy he wanted. We encouraged him to take a look out in the Mill Plain Cascade Park submarket. So it's let me get myself turned due east of 205. And ultimately, that's exactly where he landed because we put him in an area called Columbia Tech Center, which is a big master planned park. And it has people like the Banfield headquarters, Pet Hospital Company, their headquarters is out there, and Nautilus's headquarters are out there. And HP has a big presence and is now building another third campus out there. So there was a lot of activity. He just wasn't familiar with it. He didn't know what he didn't know. And a lot of his staff, more importantly, really liked this. They felt like it was a better fit. One, because half of them were coming up from San Diego and moving to campus. So this was a much shorter commute. So here we're talking about employees and, their commute times. Two, if they had relocated from out of state, which was quite a few in this case, they were used to this kind of environment because this is more typical for some of the bigger, more established pharma and bioscience groups in the major markets. It's not typical to go into downtown multi-structure buildings. They liked it because they thought it was a little bit safer because they weren't in a downtown core where we had some of what we're dealing with, but that one became only a sidebar factor. So it was one of those nice to have, but not imperative. And the parking. Because there was lots of parking here, and when you do come into downtown cores, parking becomes a factor, because one, there's always going to be a cost. And, you know, if you're in Vancouver, it's about $185 a stall. If you're in Portland, it's $245 a stall a month. But when you're in the burbs in either of those markets, it's free. So that became a very big economic impact on the overall cost to occupy this space. And we could get in building signage, because this was a brand new built single story, and they could just brand it the outside building and run with it. So we started out, at 50,000 square feet, and we got the lease signed, and then all of a sudden we needed more. And we had an option on the space, the balance of the building, but Nautilus had also signed a deal there. So our option was good after Nautilus's term. Nautilus hadn't built it out yet. And this is where the relationship with the landlord is important. And we were able to get the landlord to move Nautilus out of that building and into another building in their park at a discounted rate in order to expand Absci and give them this whole building. So when people tell you go in and beat up the landlord, that is not good advice, because you will need these favors down the road. And if you beat up the landlord, they will do you no favors. And this turned out to be a really important one, because they had needed it immediately. Some contract had come through and their projections had changed, and it had all been escalated. And so they built the whole thing out and opened it up, and they're good to go for a number of years now. We got them a really superior rate. It's cheaper in the suburbs than it is in downtown cores. Everywhere in the country, that's just a fact. And taxes tend to be, at least on this side of the river, they get a little more interesting depending on what you're doing and in which county you occupy. So also something to think about. It's one of the reasons we ended up pushing OSRAM out into Washington County and out of Multnomah County. So yeah, it's been a great success story. They are occupying not quite all of it just yet, but they're pretty close.
Yeah.
And if they need to expand again, we have a building that's slated to be constructed next door that we have what we call a first right on. So they can pop into that as well.
I have a question. So that was an existing building that they moved in. It was not.
It was a brand new building. The Pat Trust, the ownership, had built it speculatively.
Okay.
They had some land to build on and they wanted to fill out their park, and things over there were very tight. That's not a deep market either from an inventory standpoint. So they threw the dice and took a chance that they'd build that building and tenants would come, and we got there just before they completely finished the building.
It had never been occupied.
Yeah.
Okay.
To the question the gentleman asked earlier, they didn't know that they would get, a company like Absci, but now they have a significant chunk of 78,000 square feet with a very technical build out.
Yep.
That Absci uses, and the deal makes sense for everybody.
Yeah, and that was an easy one to put backup generator because it's right next to the building and the backside of it. That one was easy for all of the loading needs they have, because they take a lot of pallets each day with materials. So we've got multiple grade loading doors that have a factor for which lab space it's going into that follow certain protocols that are unique to what they're doing. It was easy to do the roof penetrations. Again, this is single story tilt up. That's the cheapest because the vertical run is very short. Where if we start getting beyond that, like we did a tech deal out in Hillsborough where it's 2 stories and the vertical run for venting the clean lab was 2, and that costs a lot more. So it's just those sorts of little things that you think about when you're looking at the building and why a certain building makes more sense. And so our job was getting Sean to understand that versus, yeah, the big fancy, cross-laminated timber building is cool and it has this nice vibe, but, cost-wise, this is going to be twice as much, where we can make this look very cool. And if you get a chance to go in there, I encourage you to visit. It's very cool. Okay.
Yeah, that's actually their lobby. I think on the day that Governor Inslee had a ribbon cutting, so it was a pretty big deal. And as Kristen said, we've heard from a number of rank and file and executive employees. They love the space, and we feel very gratified that they are happy. We want them to be happy and focus on their business and their growth. So looking to see if there's anything on the chat, but that was the end of our kind of structured scheduled presentation. But we're here to answer any questions, any comments, any thoughts, please.
Yeah, I had two questions, unrelated.
Yeah.
The first is, and I'll tell you both and then just go ahead.
And let us know who you are if you don't mind.
I'm Bill Newman, and I'm one of the entrepreneurs and residents at OBI OTRADI with, Gordon Hoffman.
Yeah.
And we ran Northwest Tech Ventures, so we invested in
yeah.
a lot of startups.
Okay.
So one question is title issues ever a concern with tenant improvements, or do you assume that the equipment has no residual value at the end of the lease term? How is that handled? And
What was it?
You said title?
title to build out tenant improvement. So
If it's, so if equipment is affixed to the ground or the wall, that's where the landlord could make a claim to keep it. If it's highly unique,
The mic is. Sorry,
but would you
the
negotiate
chat is
that?
blowing up on the mic.
Would you negotiate that on a case by case basis?
yes. And if it's unique equipment, they don't want anything to do with it. You're going to have to take it with you. If you had additional HVAC units installed on the rooftop, you're going to be able to leave that. 9 times out of 10, you can leave a backup generator that you've had installed. But if you've got some specialized equipment that's really only good for what you're doing, they're going to call it restoration. You're going to be required to remove that upon vacating the space. So when Absci vacated their space in downtown Vancouver, they had to get the crane, they had to take the windows out, and they had to pull all of their big equipment back out of there. But a lot of the extra electrical conduit and plumbing that they had run and piping, still there.
And then second question, more for our business, is with startups, we typically don't look at leases longer than 3 to 5 years because they don't seem to make sense. Either the company is going to outgrow the space or they won't be there anymore. So how do you handle dealing with startups, or do you require them to be a business be of a certain level of viability before you'll consider taking on
Well, just to be very clear, we work with anybody, no matter their circumstances. So we're representing you
Except
as
for
a
pawn
tenant,
shops.
right? Your question maybe is more directed, how do landlords feel about that?
Yeah.
Right, so we work with all manner of startups and public companies.
Mhm.
Absci, by the way, was pre-IPO before they entered into this long-term contract.
And I had to spend a fair amount of time with that landlord telling the story and making the case why this would be a good bet on their behalf to do this without telling them that they were going to go public. So it's incumbent upon us to help make the landlords understand why this is a good bet. Not all landlords will play that game, like I said earlier, but enough of them will, because they're in the business of real estate. There's no guarantees in real estate, and they all know that. So again, they want activity in their buildings. There's nothing worse for a commercial real estate owner than an empty building or a mostly empty building. That is bad. So they can make deals work, and they can figure out what it is you're doing and where you're going. There's a part of our process that always happens where they want to see financials. So, if free revenue, your financials don't really look like much. So that's where we say, okay, show the funding. Or show, projected revenues, here's the funding, they'll want to see your burn rate. We've done this with a number of tech startups, but they get it. And we also know all the landlords who are more likely to work with the young companies, understanding the nature of your business model and where you are in it.
Yeah, the funding sources are, luckily Portland has had a number of phenomenal tech exits where landlords understand that, or maybe some of them even envy or wish they had that tech startup. You recall, hark back to the days of Elemental Technologies. Nobody really knew about them way back when, and they were young and funded, and ultimately Amazon Web Services acquired them, and now they're almost 200,000 square feet a block away from here. Right. So they, the landlords do understand, it's approved, you were a company that some people are familiar with in the room. I mean, they also, young company, not really serious revenue, ultimately had a fantastic exit to Vista Private Equity, a blue chip private equity company. And so, the landlords who accommodate them are pretty happy about, how that's going.
Right, because the credit gets better with each of that. Right. That's where subleases also come in for young companies. If we can find a sublease, that is usually ideal because to your point, term is shortened and more flexible. For the good news for you right now is the market is in your favor. So
Yeah.
landlords are looking at shorter term deals as well, because they understand if for no other reason, people aren't sure how they're going to be working. You know, how much space do I need? How many of my people are going to be in 2 days a week, 3 days a week, 5 days a week? They just want to try and get in there and get some momentum going. So.
One last question on the chat. Heather asked about touching on permits and roof limitations for support like HVAC. The bioscience companies need, like certain limitations as to how many structures you can place on the roof in certain locations. Can you speak to that?
Sure. So I feel I sound like a broken record, but again, this is where we tend to go back to the single story buildings. And again, Osram was one of them. We looked at 3 different options. One of them, we ran into a payload issue with the roof. The roof was older. The way that the building had been constructed, there just weren't enough supports to hold the additional units we wanted. The building that we picked could do it, but we also had people come out on the front end. So to Jay's slide earlier about additional services, having a contractor or a specialist for HVAC coming with us on tours, if we go back for second or third looks on something, getting them up onto the roof and then getting our hands on CADs and any structural documents so that we can figure out in advance what that looks like what are some of the confines, and do we have any issues? Do we have to add a steel I-beam somewhere in order to support the structure? I mean, that's not ideal. It's not cheap. Is there another place we could put it? All part of our process, just like storing hazardous materials. That's dictated by the local municipality. So we've had to talk to the city of Hillsborough and the city of Beaverton about what are the requirements around having what has been classified as a H1 or H2 rated chemical. And, and in what quantities does that become something that we now have to mitigate, and where do we have to have
Inside, outside.
Yeah, does it have to be outside? Does it have to be 10 feet from the building? And what drainage we have to have around it? We've run into occasions where we have to have, certain reinforcements around it, like concrete reinforcements to mitigate if it were to have a leak, where it drains to, all of that kind of consideration. All part of the process that we have gone through with multiple tenants on the lab side of things, which is where outside of industrial, it tends to be, that's, you guys are the users where more of that comes into play.
By the way, another item that is heavily in your favor right now is, the most recent popular graduate. The fact that you are in OTRADI and OBI, and AppSci went from 500 feet to 78,000 square feet. Not, hopefully all of you do as well or better, but it's again, many landlords were fighting for that deal. Lots of people, would have loved to have had AppSci, and now even more so, knowing that they're a public company and growing and so forth. So
they changed landlords. Their existing landlord was really sad that he could not. He tried really hard to find a way to accommodate him, but he couldn't.
Because now to the point of it being an investor in a building, a post-IPO company is your tenant, and your ability to sell it at, a great valuation is far improved than it might have been, for a pre-IPO company or an empty building or shell or whatever. So that's a fantastic association that you have just by virtue of where you reside today. Other thoughts or comments? Anything we didn't cover? Feel free to drop us an email or link it to us. As I said, we talked to Sean in, I want to say 2014. And the big transaction didn't happen until a year and a half ago. So this is the beginning of a long, potentially long relationship. And don't hesitate to reach out. Any questions, comments?
Even if you just want to see a quarterly market report, so you can kind of, as you're going along, see where the costs are fluctuating, let us know. We can get that to you and give you a few bullet points on what the changes are from quarter to quarter, so you can sort of kind of start wrapping your head around what potential exposures you have and what options you have.
And it's okay for me to share this slide deck with everyone?
Please do, yeah. Nothing confidential there at all.
All right, great. Well,
And it
thank
looks
you
like
so
you can
much.
each take a lunch with you.
Yeah.
Well, thank you. So we'll be here if you
you.
want to stay, if you have a private question or any comments.
Well, thank you for hosting.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody, for attending
And
online.
make sure if you parked in our building, you're getting your parking validated at our front desk, please. We want you to have to pay for that.